You know, when I first got into sports media, when I was done playing football, there were a couple of years where I kind of was doing what I thought I was supposed to do, which is have a bunch of hot takes and go off on rants and everything. And it was easy because I'm kind of a volatile guy, but I never felt good about it. So I kind of transitioned into my strategy, and my approach was going to be that I want to be like a coach, and that I don't talk about how bad guys are at doing things, but more try to talk about what could they be good at. But then one of the other things that I learned in the NFL from multiple coaches, whether it was Gary Kubiak or Dom Capers or Tom Coughlin, is that you can never be comfortable with success. You always got to be looking for whatever lurks around the corner. And sometimes when I take that attitude, people who listen or watch think I'm being overly negative, when in fact I'm being exactly like DeMeco Ryans operates, which is you got to constantly be on alert for where somebody might get complacent or where something might upend all of your best laid plans. And I think right now is a good time to do that because we all feel really good about the defense, as we should. I feel like they're the best defense in the NFL, given that they did nothing but improve on paper in the offseason. They didn't lose their starters. I feel really, really good about where the Texans defense is right now, as do a lot of other people. Mina Kimes had JP Acosta on her podcast, and they both ranked the Texans as the best defense in the league, just above the Seahawks. I want to shoot some holes in that. And it's not because I genuinely want to shoot holes in it, but I want to think about, okay, where might all of this be torn asunder? What do we have to have our head on a swivel for? Bleav in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel, where right now you can get the Texans as 1.5 point underdogs versus the Bills in week 1. Yeah, see, the odds makers are doing something. I don't feel like the Texans are going to lose that game. I think it might actually be a pretty emphatic win. And yet, that's where the line on FanDuel is right now. I want to go through some of the clips from the Mina Kimes show with JP Acosta. And they have nothing but gushing praise, but they point out a couple areas where there might be holes. And just for the sake of having a little bit of fun in an off-season exercise, I'm going to tear down these arguments for optimism and jubilation and positivity. Oh, there we go. Here's JP Acosta on just simply how much fun it is to watch the Texans defense play.
Cool watching them play, because you would think by watching their fronts and some of their structures, they're sort of the antithesis of what a modern defense should be when it comes to moving people along the line of scrimmage, changing your fronts without changing your personnel. And the Texans don't do that. They just line up and they kick your butt every single time.
Yeah, and we all know that by now. They don't disguise the way a lot of other teams do. They don't just line up in multiple shifting fronts with a boatload of sim blitzes and what have you. I do think it's overstated at times how simple they are. They are able to, by looking like they're lining up vanilla, they can do some funkier things in their coverage that are really hard for offenses to figure out. I think last year, they were a little bit more simple in terms of disguise than they would have liked to be, simply because they didn't have a stable presence next to Kalen Bullock. That should be fixed with Reed Blankenship this year. But the first thought when you hear, okay, boy, they operate with a real simple scheme and they just go and they play fast. The example a lot of people bring up is the Legion of Boom for the Seahawks defense, which was kind of similar. They didn't try to be super ornate. They just lined up and played their techniques really well and kicked everybody's butt. And they were a really good defense for a long time. Ultimately, they just started to get the natural attrition that you're going to get. Guys got older, guys changed teams. You know, Richard Sherman goes here, other guys go there, and they weren't as effective. But it's still, that happens with any team, no matter what the scheme is, whether it's complex or whether it's simple. The thing that I would worry about is if the Texans don't add a few little wrinkles this year, then they might start to get a little bit more predictable. But as long as you've got a great pass rush, this is a rule that's as old as time. As long as you have a good pass rush, you can get away with running almost any kind of a philosophy or scheme on the back end, as long as guys execute it well. And as of right now, as long as they're healthy, that's what they have. So next, boy, did I even shoot that down at all? I think only in pointing out that if you have injury issues, yeah, obviously you're going to not be as good, but we'll get to that in a little bit. This is JP Acosta on what the Texans lean on.
They lean so heavily on their force multipliers, who are Danielle Hunter, Will Anderson Jr., and then in the back end, Kamari Lassiter and Stingley Jr. If they lean on those guys to generate all of the just changing the math, they're such an overwhelming force on defense.
Okay, so that's where you can, I think, realistically say, yeah, that part is true. The fact that they have these 4 pillars on defense, the 4 most important and impactful spots on your defense, your 2 edge rushers and your 2 cornerbacks. If you lose just even one of those guys, what happens then? I'm less concerned about that this year than I was last year, just because they have more guys in backup roles who are either a year older or have one more year of experience. I think that you have Kayden Bullock, which inoculates you a little bit you have Reed Blankenship added to the mix, which inoculates you a little bit against either a Jalen Petrie or a Kayden Bullock injury, because at the very least you can go back to playing 4 defensive backs more often and have some versatility in who plays the star position there. But that part of leaning on the force multipliers, I was curious about the history of the Robert Saleh / DeMeco Ryans defenses in San Francisco, and really probably the best example of the 49ers withstanding some really tough injuries was in 2020. They lost both Nick Bosa and Solomon Thomas off the defensive line. Richard Sherman and Dee Ford missed time. The 49ers had the second highest adjusted games lost since 2001, at the time at least, per Football Outsiders tracking. The team did not do well. They ended up 6-10, but Saleh's defense finished 5th in yards allowed and 6th in DVOA, which this is, I know that's DeMeco, not Saleh, but very similar strategies, simple defense, rely on your playmakers. Without some of their best playmakers there that year, they were still a really good defense. So that part of it, it's like they're not going to be as good a defense if they lose Will Anderson or if they lose Danielle Hunter. But I don't think it has to be this precipitous fall, barring multiple injuries or just a cataclysm somewhere else. I think some of the weaknesses or some of the sly potential threats this year is going to be on the margins and some of the backup players, which we'll get to in a bit. Here is Mina Kimes just basically asking, where is the weakness?
They also could even be better, which...
Oh, no, this is Mina Kimes saying they could be better.
You never want to say every team that was, first or second in just about every metric, along with Seattle. But they didn't lose guys, and that was kind of the differentiator for me. They didn't lose anyone. In fact, I think they gained a couple players who could be impactful. I really loved the Reed Blankenship signing. That was one of the positions that was a little bit of a revolving door for them at safety. And then they drafted Kayden McDonald, which was a pick that I loved, and I thought it was like, oh my God, the rich get richer.
Okay, this is where I get a little bit offended, not by anything Mina said specifically, but I think sometimes there's a feeling that, hey, all you need for a good defensive tackle to stuff the run is to have a really big body in there. And I get insulted by that as a guy who was a run-stuffing defensive tackle, but kind of undersized by run-stuffing defensive tackle standards. I was like anywhere between 305 to 315, but there are a lot of guys who are 305 or 315 that do a better job holding up to double teams, being guys that just stuff the run than some of the big body dudes. There's more than just mere physics to the situation. There's technique, there's skill, there's hand placement, there's all of that. And I am very genuinely wary of saying, hey, look, they drafted a big guy that a lot of people thought might have gone in the first round, and then there you go. He's going to be awesome. I'm optimistic about him, but like as I feel with all rookies, I don't think they're worth anything until they show that they're worth something. And it's not as simple as saying, hey, well, you lost Tim Settle, you lost Mario Edwards, you lost Foley Fatukasi, but now you've got a high draft pick, so obviously he'll be awesome. It's just not always that simple. I think that the run defense was a lot better than a lot of people thought it was last year. I spent all last year fielding questions from people saying, like, how come the Texans are so bad against the run? And I'd look around and I would check the stats and I would watch the film, and I'd have to say they're pretty damn good against the run. There are some times situationally where they had to be good against the run by adding an extra defensive lineman into the mix. And I think one of the things that they'd like to do is to not have to do that. Obviously, you're going to be a lot weaker in pass coverage if you have got 5 defensive linemen on the field. And I think there's times where DeMeco basically said as much after they drafted Kayden McDonald, said, there's times there when you really got to stop the run, and he just kind of let it trail off without saying anything. Suffice it to say, there were times last year situationally where they would have liked to have some bigger bodies in there. I think Naquan Jones might end up being a factor this year too, because he's a big dude. So here's Mina Kimes now, I Bleav, asking, all right, where are the weaknesses on this defense?
Because this is a team that was already good against the run, great against the run. Again, I was like, whoa, how bad was their short yardage run defense? It was great. The only thing that jumped out to me when I was trying to find like run defense metrics where they could get better is they were in their base defense, they were 18th in success rate. And I think that's when we're going to see the most out of Kayden McDonald. But yeah, like it really, like looking at this depth chart, JP, like where's the hole?
Yeah, where's the hole? And before I let JP Acosta answer, I'll say, off the top of my head, all right, you got to fill in that EJ Speed spot. EJ Speed played 45% of your snaps last year, and he's likely going to be out for the entire season. Whether it's Marte Mapu, whether it's Wade Woodaz, the rookie, whether it's potentially any of these other guys like Jamal Hill. Jamal Hill, by the way, was at Derek Stingley's Cover 1 camp down in, where do they do that? The Bahamas, somewhere in the Caribbean, which there was a kind of a news story last year that Al-Shaair ended up going to it. And I think Aziz ended up being better in pass coverage. That was something that he worked on. And Jamal Hill this is kind of a make it or break it year for him. I mean, look, you're a young linebacker and your team drafts 2 linebackers in Wade Woodaz and Aiden Fisher. There's some pressure on you. He's got to step up to the proverbial plate and figure out exactly, if this is the year he becomes more than just a special teamer. But there's going to be a lot of competition there. I hesitate to just say, well, I trust in DeMeco and Matt Burke and Bobby, the defensive linebackers coach, because it's not always that simple. We do that with the Astros, don't we? We say, oh, yeah, look at that. They got anybody can be a Charlie Morton or, Garrett Cole, come on in. You'll be a Cy Young candidate. Doesn't always work out that way for every pitcher with the Astros, especially when they keep getting injured all the time. But I digress. That's something to monitor. And then, let me let JP Acosta answer before I say anything else.
I spent so long trying to find somewhere where they could potentially be like a pitfall for this defense. Maybe their linebacker group. If Al-Shaair gets hurt, then you really start to worry about their depth there. But they insulate their linebackers so well. And now that you have Reed Blankenship, you have somebody who can kind of be the cleanup guy if they make any mistakes at that second level. And then up front, by adding Kayden McDonald, I want to shout out Tommy Togiai, who has been incredible for them against the run. I think having those guys up front and having your force multipliers and Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson Jr., it makes the linebackers' job so much easier because you're insulated in every area and you allow for Aziz Al-Shaair and Toto to play so much faster.
I hesitate a little bit there because I think it overly simplifies it. I mean, if we think about last year when Aziz was out in that Raiders game, especially, Ashton Genty ends up having the best game he had in his rookie season. The Texans defense did a good job, but it was against a really bad offense. And we saw more life and zest out of the Raiders than I was comfortable watching that defense allow. So I think with Henry To'oTo'o, who also could possibly be in a competitive situation with Marte Mapu this year, Henry To'oTo'o is one of those guys that's entering free agency who as of yet hasn't been extended. Now maybe we'll hear something between now and the beginning of the season where that changes. But I think it's not just the EJ Speed spot. I think there's a chance that that's a spot with Henry To'oTo'o that's open to competition. And Henry To'oTo'o would be the favorite to get it right now. But I wouldn't be overly surprised if somebody supplants him at some time. The Texans in that Bills game, the over-under is 44.5 points. So not extreme, but also I still feel like giving a little bit more. I'm guessing that's given more credit to the Bills offense than it is giving credit to the Texans offense. If it was the Texans offense and if the odds makers thought, well, the Bills don't usually do much in Houston, so they're going to have a bad performance. That might be in the low 40s or high 30s even. I choose to interpret that by FanDuel. It's setting a 44.5 points total in that game. Disrespect. I freely and liberally classify things as disrespect, and I feel disrespected by FanDuel there. But if you feel disrespected by FanDuel and you think there should be a lower one on that, I'm not going to believe in the Texans offense until the Texans offense proves it to me. I will believe in the Texans defense. The other area other than linebacker that I'm watching and monitoring closely right now is defensive end, backup defensive end. Derek Barnett and DeMeco Ryans gave you a bunch of snaps last year. And I mean, Derek Barnett's had 5 sacks in each of the last 2 seasons. It's not just quite so simple as replacing those guys. Let's remember, DeMeco Ryans got a healthy contract by the Texans 2 years ago. That was the big free agency signing on the defensive end until all of a sudden the Texans realized they had a crack at Danielle Hunter. DeMeco Ryans was going to be the guy. And then all of a sudden, Danielle Hunter comes in, DeMeco Ryans ends up having to serve out a suspension. He's had some injury issues, but he still provided a lot of snaps and a lot of presence in the field goal and extra point blocking game. But Barnett as well, you could look at this 2 ways. One, you could say, wow, that's a lot of snaps and a lot of production, about 500 snaps or so combined out of those 2 guys. Or you could say, look, when Derek Barnett was signed, he was kind of on the scrap heap. And a lot of people thought that he might not play much more football because things had kind of slid for him in Philadelphia. Then lo and behold, he comes here to Houston and he ends up being pretty damn productive. He is, unless I missed an update, he's out there still as a free agent. And I think there's a possibility they bring him back. The guys right now that are most likely to get a lot of time if Derek Barnett doesn't come back and if the Texans don't go from outside the organization are Logan Hall, who's going to be a defensive tackle, but on first and second down especially can totally play defensive end and might be that guy that, hey, he comes in on first and second down, get you a third down. That's when we bring in Will Anderson or Danielle Hunter. So you give those guys a little bit of a break. Dylan Horton played more snaps than people realized last year and did a pretty solid job of it. But he's also more of a guy that I look at as, okay, he's stout versus the run. He can provide some pass rush, but not necessarily, as of yet, not really on the level of some of the top tier. I don't even want to say top tier, like say a Derek Barnett type of edge rusher, but maybe they think that there's more development in him. Remember, he's only still a couple years removed from beating freaking cancer, which is kind of a big deal. And then Dominique Robinson's the interesting one. Dominique Robinson, who comes from Chicago and has really impressive physical traits, but's never really been able to tie it together as a pass rusher. Sometimes, I mean, the reverse example of this from a Houston perspective was Jason Babin. It was like Jason Babin was a big disappointment here as a first-round pick. He ends up going off to Seattle and ended up, when he found the right scheme, ironically enough, when he went to schemes that are a lot more like the current Texans scheme, he ended up being one of the best pass rushers in the league for a few years in Philadelphia. And then I think he also spent some time in Tennessee. But he was up there in the sack rankings in a couple of those years just because he found a better scheme fit. And maybe that's all it is with Dominique Robinson, and he ends up giving you something. My LSU Tigers will remember Ali Gay. He's back in the fold. Solomon Byrd is a few years into it now. He's been a practice squad guy. He's always impressed me. I've always been intrigued by him because he's a guy that was very polished coming out of college. But then you add some of the rookie free agents at Sebastian Harsh and a few of those other guys. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Derek Barnett comes back, or perhaps the Texans go outside the building. There was a report from Schefter, I believe, that Joey Bosa, who was out there as a free agent, is either retiring or at least unlikely to play at the beginning of the season. He might be, Sean Pendergast and I were talking about it this morning. Maybe he ends up being one of those guys that it signs midway through the season, like in Ndamukong Suh, and maybe the Texans will be in the market for somebody like that at some point. So by and large, this was hard for me, really. I didn't end up being nearly as pessimistic as I thought I would be. It just feels like cheating to say, well, injuries, that's what you got to worry about. I mean, you can say that about every single team every year. If they are hit with the injury bug, one of those 4 pillar guys, one of the cornerbacks or one of the edge rushers, I think is going to be the biggest hit. What you hope for is that whether it's Jalen Smith or on the defensive line, where maybe it's Dylan Horton, maybe it's Dominique Robinson, maybe somebody comes along and is able to step in more adequately than we thought they could. And just by virtue of the fact that you've got 11 guys now, 10 starters. 10 of the starters have been in the system already and are going to be able to hopefully be that much better. And hopefully the Texans are able to disguise a little bit more. A couple of more little one-offs from Mina on this one. One is just something that I think is an opinion that she shares probably with a lot of people. Kamari Lassiter might be her favorite player in the NFL.
Kamari Lassiter is like my favorite player in the league. I got a Lassiter stat that I love, but they have a stat that I think they added fairly recently, which was the percentage of the time a DB is in tight coverage at the snap. Kamari was first out of every corner in the NFL in terms of the percentage of time when he was in coverage that it was tight coverage. He is an elite tackler, we know that, but I think he's really continued to improve as a cover corner as well.
Yes, he's definitely improved as a cover corner. I am curious about whether that just simply means press man or if it's something more than that. Maybe it's distance from the line of scrimmage. I think that any of the fears that people had about Kamari Lassiter's straight ahead speed with his 40-yard dash have been put to bed. And I do wonder too, just how much teams are starting to how they're starting to approach Kamari versus Derek Stingley. And which guy do we really want to target here? When do we want to try to take our opportunities, versus either of those guys? Obviously, they've both had a bunch of turnover production. Kamari wants to get the ball in his hands more than just pass breakups. That's what he said. That's not my words. But I was a little bit surprised that it was as heavily that he was maybe up on the line of scrimmage that much more frequently than everybody else. But that's another one where I think the perception that, hey, the Texans, they play all this zone and teams are going to be able to, really good teams are going to be able to carve them up. It's way more nuanced than that. And they do mix and match their coverages. And then in playing match coverage, they make things look simpler than they actually are. And that's where those guys excel, is identifying these route patterns and figuring it out and not using it, not allowing teams to exploit their supposed simplicity. One more on Mina Kimes about Reed Blankenship. And this brings up something going back to what we talked about earlier. Hopefully they can add the illusion of complexity. You want to be as simple as possible, but give the illusion of complexity. That's what throws offenses and defenses into a tizzy. When you got teams that look really, really simple, but they're actually operating way more complex. Here's Mina on Reed Blankenship.
If I was dropping Reed Blankenship onto a defense where there was issues in the secondary, I might feel a little bit different. I think he's a good player, but I think you saw in Philadelphia when he was also part of an elite secondary, he's great as that final guy, and he gets to be the final guy here.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think the enthusiasm for Reed Blankenship was appropriate by Texans fans. It wasn't going to be the marquee signing, and when they signed him, I can't remember on the timing of it. Was that when people were still agitated that the Texans hadn't made any moves yet? We go through this every year, where the Texans don't make any moves in the first couple days and people freak out and they don't realize that there are still smart decisions to be made and guys to bring in, because we see it over and over again. Look, by definition, if you're paying top of the market for any player, no matter how good they are, you're overpaying because you're the high bidder. So whatever the market price is or anything, or the going rate, you're paying the highest amount. And if you do it routinely and you're spending exorbitantly, it can be a highway to disaster. I think Caserio, by and large, has done a pretty good job of being aggressive but without overspending, and Reed Blankenship is the perfect guy for that. But I agree with Mina in that if he was the guy you were signing or trading for, say like the Chiefs did, like the Rams did with Trent McDuffie, like you wouldn't be as excited about Reed Blankenship as you would be about Trent McDuffie and how excited those guys are out there with the Rams. I think that it's the perfect signing for this secondary. And I like my big some takeaway of all of it is, as I try to be pessimistic about it, is I just I've got that feeling where I feel so good about something that you kind of wait for, like, oh, nope. I watch a lot of Netflix and everything's going really well. We got 3 more episodes in the season. Something bad's about to happen. There's that natural negative bias that we're hardwired for as human beings, and then we're also really well trained and indoctrinated by Netflix and reading novels. So that's where I am right now. Head on a swivel, everybody. We must remain vigilant. Please like and subscribe. Thanks to FanDuel for sponsoring. And if you find yourself here often, just go ahead and subscribe. Leave a like. If you're listening on Apple or iTunes, Apple iTunes or Spotrac. My God, Spotify. Spotrac, the salary cap website. And if somehow you're listening on Spotrac, then by all means, like and subscribe if they give you the option to do so. Until then, everybody have a great day.